Call sign Fuzzy. The scout fighter's pilot call sign was Fuzzy, which was not entirely and in any way related to his racial features. Indeed, bunnies had at least some short, fuzzy hair. His, in fact, was longer than most, and for the life of him couldn't understand, back then, when his flight instructor, Captain Jericho, gave him the call sign, nor now fathom why. His white, brownish, and intricately spotted fur was well hidden beneath the pilot's spacesuit now, a standard Colonial Navy issue. That was as far as standard equipment went around his squadron, and this was being distributed one by the suppliers back in his colony of birth, Aurelia Secundus. What he and his wingmen piloted through was anything but a standard issue craft. Scout fighters were often used to screen bigger starships and collect additional scan data. Yet, by design, the scouts' weaponry was limited. Even though their size was the same as other space superior fighters, instead of multiple weapon mounts, the scout fighter had extra, light powerful sensor arrays, extended fuel tanks, and atmospheric wings. Its main weapon array was used primarily for self-defense, since the purpose of a scout was not to defeat the enemy, but rather locate it and fly back to its base bearing the priceless scan data. Some fighters were also equipped with top-of-the-line engines to give them a much-needed edge in speed. In stark contrast with most navies, Terran scouts often carried jury-rigged fuel pods, sensor decoys, and even long-range missiles. His industrious human patrons often made use of battlefield salvage to construct more scout crafts. Scout squadrons employed by the Colonial Navy units like his were a force recon unit, and as such more numerous and often accompanied by retrofitted shuttlecrafts. Those provided the on-the-spot refuel and rearm and can always pick up ejected pilots if need be. According to what he was taught about Terran combat doctrine, the scout fighter's secondary objective was to destroy their enemy counterparts, therefore mitigating the enemy's ability to ward against any future ambushes. Fighter pilots in the Colonial Navy flew their scouts as if they were piloting standard SSF fighters. The fact that these ships weren't that heavily armed meant nothing to the experienced pilots of the Terran monarchy. A fleet, a carrier, or a base without its scouts was a vulnerable target. Colonial Navy pilots often used their superior skills, accumulated during years of piloting scout fighters, to a devastating effect. Colonial Navy scout wings made use of their scanner arrays to trick enemies by creating ghost targets, many times outright confusing and overpowering the enemy sensor operators and giving their allies as much needed in edge of combat. His own unit, based on board the Shirokov, was given the choice to volunteer for a mission of great importance, and Fuzzy stepped forward, just like the rest of his wingmates. Now, after a whole set of hyperjumps facilitated by their support crafts and refueling on the move, his squadron, the Gruff Shooters, entered the outskirts of the Gamor system. Immediately after the modified shuttle, which was his wing support craft, dispatched its hyperjump silhouette, they all set their systems on condition white. The only thing their spacesuits had better than those sold on the open market was their life support system. It was shielded, reinforced, and made to conceal the life signature of its wearer. How successful would that work against someone equipped with a system strong sensor array was yet to be tested in the field. Fuzzy gulped nervously and punched his part in the system navigational data into the mainframe. There were a set of numbers of nav points that each craft had to scout, with their long-range sensors set on passive mode as to not alert any possible enemies who might be lurking about. Operational parameters were simple. Do not get seen nor detected, but scout, scan everything you could, and return back with the data. It was the best scout fighter pilot's job description if he ever had one. Ever. They were given specific orders not to engage in combat unless absolutely necessary. This meant that if you are even in a remotely close chance to get detected, run like hell. What he expected, though, was that they might get jumped by cloaked fighters and forced to accept the fight. Why cloaked? The Jaren were using those types of shields excessively and had them installed in all their ships. Even their motherships, as he was told, had one. His lonely machine slowly drifted on course towards the next nav point, engines off and systems cold. Textbook execution of system condition white cadet. Captain Jericho would rumble under his mustache before lecturing Fuzzy and the rest about something else, equally as important as his knowledge of system operations. The diligent bunny had basically memorized the entire EWS combat manual from cover to cover and then some. Thankfully, nobody caught him after he had unknowingly hacked the local GNet system node and downloaded some obscure set of alien hollow books detailing the same subject. Improvise, adapt, overcome, and survive. That was also something that the cadet master, Captain Jericho, would mention fondly and multiple times over their apprenticeship. They had memorized it and even said it was the same gruff tone of their teacher used. This was indeed a training course most unusual, in fact. Despite the traditionally accepted ways, they had only one single master and many students, just like some of the big colonial academies. Back then, the situation wasn't cabinet at all. A large enemy force was preparing to invade their system, and all youngsters were transported off-world to an undisclosed training facility, far away from the battle zone, they thought. That, in fact, was not to be the case, and Fuzzy, together with his fellow cadets and their captain, had to join the battle, despite the fact that their education was not yet fully complete. Fuzzy's sensor array caught something an hour later when he was flying around the third and final nav point. His paws rapidly flew over the sensor controls. Condition white for a scout fighter meant that except his main sensor array working on minimal power, everything else was turned off. That was the case even with their maneuvering thrusters. Colonial Navy had their craft retrofitted with low-yield chemical rockets, limited fuel capacity, but no high energy spikes that might increase their energy signature. And that was best. They produced considerably less heat than the plasma drives. After a short flight with his sensor controls, Fuzzy produced at first on the optical array a couple of excellent holoslides for the large and well-hidden enemy asteroid outpost. It had just splashed on his screen because some supply vessel was being engulfed in its cloak field, warping and amplifying the background star echo coming from a distant pulsar. Fuzzy grinned from ear to ear behind his spacesuit's faceplate. Improvise. On one side, he could lurk here for a minute more, then try to slip undetected after performing a passive scan of that base. He might even discover their cloaking shield's wavelength. Then again, he might get easily discovered by the enemy. It was a trade-off, an eternal battle with time where everything counted. Each second, another nail in your coffin, yours or your enemy's. Perhaps he could recalibrate the main sensor array to use the pulsar song and analyze how it got devoured by the cloaking shield. Maybe then he could find its weak spots. He was all about risk, calculated risk or none at all. Fuzzy invested the 36 seconds that he needed to perform that initial recalibration and waited for another 55 until the next radio wave pulse had hit their shields. The suit's life support, although extended, had its limits. Fuzzy had already reached them and was, in fact, surpassing them. Concentrating on his works and trying to slow his breathing as much as possible. Adapt. He was already noticing the lack of oxygen slowing him down. Fuzzy waited 2 more minutes and held as long as his trained body could overcome. Securing the last terabytes of scan data, hundreds of holoslides, and having recorded the pulsar song, Fuzzy first activated the life support system of his scout fighter, then used what fuel was left in the tanks of those chem boosters to set a new course. He'd in fact slowly drift away from the last nav point and dangerously close to that enemy base. If he should activate his engines here, they'd notice him immediately, even low burn, for he had divined the purpose of that Jarian facility. It was an advanced hyperspace inhibitor. Those were expensive and rarely used, though the very fact they had one deployed here in this system meant that whatever it was down on Galmor Prime. They were ready to protect it at all costs. His modified huge asteroid would pull most big ships out of hyperspace prematurely, conveniently close and in range of its powerful big guns, mines, and tractor beams. Colonial Navy Command may have had plans for this system, though they now had to rethink them and or drastically reevaluate their entire strategy. That was not Fuzzy's main concern right now, for he was about to fly on full engine burn. His job was not yet complete. Not enough was it that he got his intelligence. The data had to be delivered back, and Fuzzy flipped the main power switch, spooling the plasma chamber. Nearby, and suspiciously close on his 6, as if by some obscure magic spell, decloaked one entire squadron of enemy ships, scout fighters. Rotten carrots. So they were fast, quick, Although not that well armed, perhaps, Fuzzy smirked and activated all his systems. There was no point hiding anymore. The engine of his fighter spewed hot plasma drive, quickly increasing his speed, and while the enemy fell back for a moment, their fighter soon caught up. A fleeting hope it was that he'd be faster than they were. He used the thrusters to turn around and began locking on one after the other, naming each one of his long-range missiles as a target, then ran the EWS system on full sensor interference, punching a big red button that said, "Fire all missiles" on it. For a moment, it looked like his missiles would all hit, and the enemy craft with sensor screens full of noise would lose him. He shot down half of them dead. The rest? Well, they caught up behind him and began firing their PPGs. From a distance, he had the advantage, his craft already reaching its maximum engine burn, so he used its maneuvering thrusters to dodge their incoming fire as best he could, while firing back them with his auto railgun. He was so close to the exfil point. Fuzzy only needed to get close enough so that his mainframe could establish a secure connection with support craft and upload the data. Nothing else mattered now more than survival. This was a small excerpt from the third Starshatter book, Treads of Vengeance, which should come out on Amazon very soon, if not already. You can also check out Starshatter, the first book, as well as the second book, Twin Sons of Corolla. And you can support the author, Black Knight of Bulgaria, on Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day.